He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, nau mai hara mai ki te ao hurahanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World, ko Clark and Gannon tēnei. Weather's always been a bit of a safe topic of conversation in Aotearoa, especially if you want to steer away from more contentious issues like sports, politics, or bird of the year. Less so these days, because weather, particularly the sort that ruins roads, destroys bridges, and floods homes, is becoming quite contentious. Because climate change. In this episode of Our Changing World, senior producer Phil Vine examines the impact of global warming on destructive weather events. How much of it is the fault of humans? How much is just nature doing its thing?
The weather system is chaotic. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, that will change the weather here.
New Zealand isn't some utopian place that we're not going to experience anything because of climate change.
We worry about things once they happen, but once they happen, it's too late.
We're always asking people to do something about climate change. They deserve to know, as best we can do it, what climate change is doing to them.
Oxford's received a number of flood warnings now over the last 24 hours or so.
Oxford, England, January 2003.
And levels are steadily increasing and rising to the point where we're concerned about property flooding.
One of those properties, the home of Oxford University physics professor Miles Allen.
At the time, I'd been working for the past few years on the methods we use for quantifying human influence in global climate.
As water from the River Thames laps at his doorstep, he does what any conscientious scientist would do. Writes a sternly worded article to a journal that would launch a new branch of science. The water levels were coming up close to your kitchen door, and instead of filling sandbags, you were there at the keyboard whacking out this paper about climate attribution.
Well, to be honest, this is after I'd established I couldn't find any sandbags.
Almost as annoying as the lack of sandbags, on the radio they were busy saying this extreme flooding was just ordinary weather, not climate change.
The mantra from the Met Office and other institutions was, well, you cannot attribute any individual weather event to climate change. And I just felt that we needed to do better than that.
And we did. Well, we being the international climate science community, including our next guest. I'm waiting for climate scientist Luke Harrington as we travel from a flooded Oxford to a soggy downtown Auckland. It's raining in Tamaki Makaurau. What's new? G'day Luke, how you doing?
Yeah.
Pleased to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Thanks for coming out on this
no worries.
fabulous Auckland day. Hey, Tim, can you clear something up? Is this climate or is it weather?
Well, what's the saying? Climate is what you expect, the weather is what you get.
Okay. And climate attribution, is it sort of naive to describe it as how much climate is in the weather?
The simple way that we talk about it is how much more intense or more likely was that event in terms of how much has it changed compared to a world where we haven't added greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Okay, that's climate attribution in a nutshell. Let's go inside and pluck it apart.
My name's Luke Harrington. I'm a senior lecturer in climate change at the University of Waikato.
And one of the leading lights of extreme event attribution, to give the science its proper name.
One of the key ways in which it's really powerful is that it demonstrates that climate change isn't a future problem. It's not something that you're going to see play out in 50 years' time. It's already playing out now.
Powerful floodwaters ploughed through a bridge and took out trees.
Remember 2023?
Holy shit! Front yards turned to an angry tide.
Our largest city on anniversary weekend, the 29th of January.
This building swept off its foundations into a car park.
The Auckland floods, 7,000 homes damaged, 4 people killed. And not 2 weeks later,
February the 9th, and all eyes are on tropical cyclone.
Meteorologists have warned the latest storm brewing.
With tropical cyclone Gabrielle gathering strength in the Pacific and expected to smash into the North Island from late Sunday night.
And smash it did. creating 850,000 landslides, leaving 11 dead.
Absolute devastation, the most catastrophic weather event in living memory.
A lot of families displaced, a lot of homes without power.
Climate change was on many people's lips.
The devastation is just, it just makes you want to cry, to be honest.
As rescue services worked around the clock, Luke and his international colleagues were also scrambling to try and find out how much of Cyclone Gabrielle was down to climate change.
We worked in collaboration with the World Weather Attribution Project, so that's colleagues from all around Europe and the US.
Using huge, noisy supercomputers to run models of the New Zealand climate.
So we'll simulate a full year of weather for the year 2023, right? And then we repeat that process. We just let it run, do whatever it likes for the year of 2023 again. We do it again, and we do it again, and we might have several thousand versions.
Why so many times?
For us to understand the risks at the tail. So we're going to have a whole bunch of years in these simulations which nothing exciting is happening. But there will be a couple of events that happen across all of those model years which are as extreme as the one that we're interested in.
They're compared against models of our weather before humans started warming the planet.
Typically what we do is try to set the state of the atmosphere and all of the things that we've added into the atmosphere back to what it would have looked like in the 1850s.
And rather than put out some academic paper way down the track,
the bridge on State Highway 35 has completely been washed away.
They wanted to demonstrate the link between global warming and Gabrielle while it was still in the news.
If it's 12 to 18 months after the event happened, the public doesn't really care.
But does that speed come at the cost of accuracy?
It's a double-edged sword because there's a risk, and there's certainly a lot of critique in the scientific community that you're not doing rigorous enough science, which is valid. What we try to do is sort of apply methodologies which have been done many times over and have been peer-reviewed, and other papers have followed the same sort of procedures.
Adding in historic rainfall data and comparing studies done on recent floods in Canterbury and Westport, the international team came up with a figure.
We found that the amount of rain which fell out of the weather system was definitely more intense, on the order of, depending on what you're looking at, about 10 to 15% more rain fell out of those systems for both the July Westport flooding event and also the May 2021 Canterbury event.
It was the same for Gabrielle, an estimated 10 to 15% bump in rainfall, which may not seem like much, but that extra rain can equate to heaps more physical damage.
Yes, my name is Ilan Noy. I've been the chair of the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Te Rangawaka, Victoria University of Wellington.
Ilan's an economist who works alongside climate scientists, putting dollar values on extreme weather events.
And I think it's very important to measure that so that we can manage it better. We can assess what we need to do.
It's called impact studies, identifying how much of that weather damage is down to human-induced global warming. In 2017, Ilan, Luke and others were asked by the Treasury to cost out climate change from weather events.
According to research, between 2007 and 2017, drought cost us around $720 million.
And the bill from climate-induced flood damage over 10 years was $120 million. This impact study a world first.
As far as I know, this is the first time something like that was done anywhere, actually.
So if climate scientists come up with a figure like a tropical cyclone has been made 30% worse, or there's 30% more rainfall than if we hadn't filled the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, do you just multiply the total cost by 30%, or is it more complicated than that?
No, it's definitely more complicated than that, because it's not necessarily the case that 30% more rain, even if 30% more rain would lead to 30% more flood, meaning more flood depth, that does not necessarily mean 30% more damages. You can even think about that in terms of, a single home. A single home might be above ground by 50 centimeters, so 48 centimeters of flooding would not do any damage to the home, but 52 centimeters of flooding would do a lot of damage to the home.
Tonight, the forecast is urgent and distressing.
Elan was part of a climate attribution study on the economic cost of Hurricane Harvey in the States.
Hurricane Harvey intensifying rapidly, expected to slam into Texas as a Category 3.
The government wanted to know how much more damage was caused by climate change.
Then we concluded that 40% of the rain means 50% of the property, means 60% of the damages. So 60% of the damages are because of climate change, while only 40% of the rain.
As Elan says, it's important to measure these things so we can manage them, but attribution calculations may serve a larger purpose. Bringing home that climate change is a risk to people and property here and now. So is it working? Was Cyclone Gabrielle, with its $10 billion plus bill, literally a watershed moment?
You know, there are some people who are suffering absolute misery as a result of these weather events, and there's the rest of us around it who definitely sympathise with that, but I don't know if we've really meaningfully thought about what would have been the case if that was us in their shoes.
Why is that? Why can't we imagine it was our home full of water or falling down a cliff?
I'm Dr. Lauren Vernell. I'm a lecturer of emergency management at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University, based in Wellington. My background is in, risk, behaviour and perception.
Research she's read suggests that even if you've been through extreme weather events, you're not necessarily going to change your behaviour.
No, it depends to quite a large extent on the nature of people's experiences. So if people haven't been impacted too badly, that can actually demotivate them to prepare. So there's this bias called the normalisation bias, where people, look back on their past experiences and say, oh, that flooding event wasn't too bad, so I'll be all right in future flooding events, which is, obviously not quite logical.
Also, humans, says Lauren, have a way of reading what they want to into bad experiences.
The idea that's prominent within the field of psychology is that we're not very good at thinking about these really big risks. They're just a little bit too scary. So any ways we can find to psychologically protect ourselves from these big scary things, we call them cognitive biases, we tend to fall into that way of thinking.
Which reveals itself in Lauren's research. When people react to the expression that you might hear a lot, it's a 1 in 100-year event.
If we say 1 in 100-year event, we know people are more likely to think that the event will happen towards the end of that time window, so in 100 years rather than this year. And, potentially people who've just experienced what we tell them is a 1 in 100-year event, they might think, well, sweet, I'm fine for a century, when in fact that's simply not the case. One of the challenges we've had with getting people to, be concerned and act on climate change is what we call psychological distance. So it used to be, abstract, it's happening in the future, far away, to people not like us.
Miles Allen from Oxford admits a bit of a mea culpa on behalf of climate scientists for this psychological distance.
We've tended to really emphasize the very long-term impacts of climate change, which are, of course, potentially very serious. But by talking about climate change beyond 2100 for many, many years, we obviously give people the impression that's the timescale we're talking about, and that up until then, they won't notice anything. And I think that one of the things that has really happened over the past decade or so has been a recognition by lots of people that, climate change is already happening and we're already seeing changes which people are feeling.
One of the more famous quotes from Miles in his original attribution paper was about how public opinion would switch when people's homes got threatened. I asked climate change lecturer Luke Harrington about this. He said that the most impassioned eco-warrior has nothing on a homeowner facing negative equity from flooding.
Yes, the people who are facing negative equity on their houses, they're the ones that you might see the fury of. But to be honest, you don't, because I think they're kind of broken. I mean, there isn't the systems that are currently in place, particularly around how insurance policies are set. Insurers can pull out with they can reset their policies every 12 months, and if they choose that they no longer want to provide coverage, then they can remove that coverage, and that's just what's going to happen.
Do you think insurers will pull out of areas which are vulnerable?
Absolutely. I mean, they have access to modelling information that
we don't. They can do that.
That climate scientists don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because they can...
Where are they getting that from?
Well, they can commission their own modelling and then keep it in-house and say it's proprietary information.
And they're doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite common practice.
Luke says insurance companies are using that secret information to work out which buildings in New Zealand are too iffy to insure, and it's a big number.
I mean, I don't want to speculate too much. I mean, there has been modelling work done by NIWA, where I think the number of properties which are at risk of a significant fluvial flooding, inundation, so flooding from river, I think is somewhere on the order of like 700,000 buildings or something like that.
700,000 buildings, all at significant risk from flooding and potentially uninsurable.
Because, I mean, a large part of the country, you're either got steep topography near you and river catchments, or you're on a floodplain. So I don't find it that surprising, personally.
I think people will, though.
Yeah.
Another edgy aspect of climate attribution that Miles predicted as he failed to find the sandbags for the Oxford flood, ordinary people taking companies to court for climate-related weather damage.
If people can point to a profitable activity that's inflicting harm on other people, that is the kind of thing in which ultimately the courts may get involved.
Effectively, Miles was thinking, if my house gets flooded, who can I sue?
While we had previously kind of thought of this as not an answerable question, that's kind of because we'd been asking the wrong sort of question. Kia ora, I'm Dahi Stone. I'm a climate scientist at NIWA, the National Institute of Weather and Atmospheric Research. And we've been thinking of it as a direct who actually poured the water in front of my house rather than who's made this event more likely.
It's more of a likelihood thing than a direct causal link.
Yeah, so it's more about statistics. You get this in health very often, right? We have all these things that make heart attacks more common.
Here's Luke again.
It's certainly very much an emerging field of research. In terms of liability, I mean, there's a famous case that's currently ongoing in the German courts about a Peruvian farmer and looking at the risks of a glacial lake outburst flood in his town.
La Cordillera Blanca es la cordillera tropical más alta y más extensa en el mundo.
A local news report shows Saul Luciano walking up to a powder blue glacial tarn, Lake Palacocha, situated precariously above the place he lives. The melting glacier above is threatening to send avalanches into the lake. Saul's village is right in the danger zone.
That case actually is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out, because colleagues of mine have done some really, really decent research basically showing that for something like that, where the size of a glacial lake at the terminus of the glacier is linked to the amount of glacial melt, which is very, very strongly correlated to increases in temperatures.
The defendants aren't Peruvian, but a massive power company, RWE, 10,000 kilometres away in Germany.
We're going to use force to bring it to the identity check.
The company made international headlines last year when Greta Thunberg turned up to protest a new open-cast coal mine and got arrested.
So there's actually a very strong climate change signal there, a definitive one, not just this probabilistic one. It's actually, yes, that lake wouldn't have been that large without climate change. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Saul Luciano's not asking for huge money, only 20 grand, to help with flood protection to shield his town, but it's a test case. Ilan Noy says there's tons more scope for such legal actions. He's just finished some interesting global research, estimating the bill for the world's total weather damage caused by climate change.
Our calculation leads us to the number $140 billion a year in the last 20 years. So this is not a forecast about the future. This is an estimation of the past. The last 20 years, because of climate change, the cost of climate change through extreme weather events was $140 billion on average a year.
To save you the trouble, that's $16 million US an hour. To me, it seems like an awful lot of money, but then again, maybe not quite as much as I might have expected. What about you? Were you surprised at the figure?
So $140 billion, is that a lot or not? It's more than I have in my bank account. I don't know your bank account.
Same.
Willing to bet it's more than what you have.
And while we're doing sums, it'll soon be possible to work out what percentage of that climate weather bill, $140 billion a year, that you're responsible for. Yes, you.
I'm 54-year-old, so I've lived a certain number of years and was responsible for a certain amount of emissions. And that emissions made the climate change problem a bit worse. Now, that bit, of course, it's not $140 million. I'm not RWE. My contribution to global emissions is significantly lower than RWE, but it's still a number. And yes, we can quantify that, and we can say Illinois is responsible for some amount of dollars. I haven't done the quantification for myself. Maybe I won't be able to sleep at night if I do.
Dahi Stone at NIWA has been working on this with some colleagues in the UK.
You have this marker of this extreme event that you've just experienced and understanding how that fits within climate change, and that kind of translates what climate change is for you. The world works in dollars, and so if we translate that into dollars in your pocket, that is a translation that helps contextualize climate change.
There are a few concerns there. So, firstly, if you're giving people that kind of information, you really need to also tell them what they can do about it.
Lauren Vanell again.
We don't want to just make people feel guilty because then they'll disengage.
Professor Miles Allen says we must be careful what we do with the information we collect and who we blame.
I think we need to be clear on what is happening, but we also need to recognize that pointing fingers can be divisive, and it's not always the most constructive thing to do. And pointing fingers at people who have very little agency, blaming them for things they don't feel they could avoid doing, I think is very unhelpful.
When I caught up with the father of climate attribution, the Oxford professor was in the lion's den, petrochemical lions.
Look, I'm speaking to you here from Houston, from a big energy conference.
I wanted to welcome you to CERAWeek, the very beginning
CERAWeek, a premier global get-together for oil and gas companies. He was speaking alongside Bill Gates and the US Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm.
The world will need secure supplies of both traditional and new energy for the foreseeable future. That's one that everybody can applaud in this room.
Miles was about to talk to the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters about stopping greenhouse gas emissions.
At the end of the day, climate change is overwhelmingly caused by four products: coal, oil, natural gas, and cement. Those products are made and sold by, most of them, fewer than 100 companies. So, that's where we need to focus the conversation.
At this conference, Miles, that you're at, are there some of those companies represented there?
Absolutely. I think they're all here.
Yep. Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP. What can you say to them to kind of bring home that message?
Well, they invited me. They're interested in the transition and in what's happening. And as I emphasized to them, look, you've got a choice here. You could sell something that causes global warming, or you could sell something else that doesn't.
Then he has to go.
Wish me luck in my session on decarbonization of fossil fuels.
When are you speaking?
In about 15 minutes.
Oh my gosh!
So,
okay.
Who knows? This may be our last conversation, depending on how badly it goes.
Well, all right. Thank you so much, Professor Allen.
Right.
Thank you for your time. Yeah. Goodbye now.
Bye for now.
I'm happy to report, Claire, that Miles made it out of CERAWeek intact. Thankfully, this wasn't his last conversation.
This episode was researched and reported by senior producer Phil Vine. Thanks to the people featured in this episode: Professor Miles Allen, Dr. Ilan Noy, Dr. Dahi Stone, Dr. Lauren Vanell, and Dr. Luke Harrington. This episode was produced by Phil Vine with help from me, Claire Kincannon, and Ellen Rikers. Sound engineering was by Blair Stagpool. Tim Watkin is the executive producer of podcasts and series at RNZ. Visit our webpage at rnz.co.nz/ourchangingworld to learn more about this topic. And if you have feedback for us, you can email ourchangingworld@rnz.co.nz. Tēnā koe I whakarongo mai. Thanks so much for listening. Ko klek and kana na hau. Kia pai te wiki.